Hello and welcome. I'm Shree. I'm your English educator for grades 11 and 12. So far, we've done a couple of lessons already. We've done the first lesson for grade 11, we've done the first lesson and the first poem for grade 12, and today we're going to be doing the first poem for grade 11. Before we get into that, a couple of things that I usually let people know is that first, class timings are from 3 to 4 every day. So I will be taking English every day except Sunday from 3 to 4 p.m. And Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays are for grade 12 portions. Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays are for grade 11 portions. Sometimes we will have classes at odd hours and you will get notifications about those on YouTube suddenly. I know that you might not find it very easy to just kind of keep an eye out for YouTube all the time, so I want to let you know that there's this Telegram channel that exists for Unacademy class 11 and 12. It's down in the description box. There should be a link for the channel. You can click on it and you can join it, and it'll basically give you updates about what class is going to happen, what lesson is going to happen, etc., etc. And that would be basically a really easy, kind of concise way of keeping all of your information in one place. And I thought that might be easier than just having to come to YouTube and check it all the time. So yeah, that's something I wanted to let you know about. And we are still having pre-recorded classes. I am hoping that I will go live soon. There are currently a lot of, sorry, that's a buzzing insect. There are a lot of technical difficulties where I am right now, and that means that my internet currently isn't working well enough for me to go live, but I'm hoping to go live so that I can talk to some of you and we can have more of a classroom experience. But currently that's not possible, so I'm still recording my classes so that at least you get to watch some content at some time. That said though, I still do wish we could talk, and because of that I want to let you know that the comments are completely yours. Feel free to go absolutely wild in them. Ask me questions about the lesson, ask me questions about things that I've said, ask me questions about anything to do with the English syllabus for grades 11 and 12. I'm looking at the comments, I'm reading your chats, and I am taking everything that you say very seriously. So yeah, I will definitely reply to you if you have a question or anything of the sort. And I actually do want to address one particular thing. I read this in a couple of chats. People have been asking me why I'm not teaching in Hindi. The thing is, I can't speak Hindi. I briefly lived in a Hindi speaking area for a while, so I grasped enough of it to be able to read words and to be able to understand the meanings of things that people say, but I'm afraid that I can't speak it. If I tried to speak it, I would probably not even be able to make like 2 whole sentences of Hindi. So if I was trying to teach in Hindi, I wouldn't be able to really communicate many things to you. So I will be sticking to teaching English. That's the language that I'm going to be teaching in. But if you have any questions or any doubts about what I'm saying, or you have any issues with the ways that I'm teaching in English, then please let me know. And if there's any sort of gap that's occurring because I'm speaking in English, then let me know about that too, and we can work together to try to sort that out and make this as useful for you as possible too. I hope that helps a little bit, and I hope that also addresses the question about why I'm not teaching in Hindi. Yes, that's what I wanted to let you know today. And yeah, we'll be doing our 11th grade poem today. So this poem is called A Photograph, and it's by someone called Shirley Tilson. Shirley Tilson is actually a pretty famous poet herself. Uh, she's very well known for writing poetry on 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 the location in the different places in Britain. Um, she's what could be called a sort of travel writer before maybe there was even such a thing called travel writing. So that's what Shirley Tilson is pretty well known for, and she's also known for writing about the traditions of England and things like that. In this poem, however, we get something that's quite different from all of these particular arenas that she is well known for. In this poem, we get something that's very personal, an intimate snapshot of a moment, a couple of moments. And snapshot is a good word because the poem is titled A Photograph. That title, kind of tells us what the poem is going to be about. It's going to be about a photograph. And before we get into the actual poem, I want to start by asking you something, which is, what are your thoughts on photographs? That's a very big question, I know. But there's a lot of present day debate about taking photographs, right? Some people like it, some people hate it, some people think we care too much about photographs and cameras and things like that, and that it's important to really stay in the moment and not invest ourselves in things like taking some sort of permanent capture of those moments. So yeah, I wondered if you had any thoughts about photographs, and if so, what they are. Let me know about those. While you're thinking about that and maybe typing down some of what you're thinking about that, I'm also going to let you know that we're going to be going forward with this poem in a way that's slightly different from the way that we go forward with prose. Usually what we do with prose is we take a couple of paragraphs and we read it and we understand it, and then we move forward and talk about things. But for the poem, we're going to start by reading the entire thing together once first. This is because these poems are very short, and so we get the chance to read the entire thing together and form an impression of what's happening in the entire thing, and then we can get into the details of the thing, right? So that's the kind of experience that we're sort of going for. So that said, I hope you've been writing down what photographs mean to you. I will be looking at the comments in the chat. Yeah, let's get into the poem. I'll read the entire thing for us once. The cardboard shows me how it was when the two girl cousins went paddling, each one holding one of my mother's hands, and she the big girl, some 12 years or so. All three stood still to smile through their hair at the uncle with the camera. A sweet face, my mother's. That was before I was born. And the sea, which appears to have changed less, watched their terribly transient mood. Some 20, 30 years later, she'd laugh at the snapshot. See Betty and Dolly, she'd say, and look how they dressed us for the beach. The sea holiday was her past. Mine is her laughter. Both wry with the labored ease of loss. Now she's been dead nearly as many years as that girl lived, and of this circumstance there is nothing to say at all. It's silence silences. That is the entirety of the poem. So we're going to get into dissecting the poem and breaking it down for us in a moment, but first I want to give us a moment to think about what we've made of the poem so far. What are our feelings? What are our thoughts? Is there some particular line that stood out to you? Is there some particular section that particularly caught your eye? Just some things for you to sort of think about before we start talking talking about the poem, and I'm going to give us like 5 seconds to sit with this question. And I think that should be around 5 seconds. So, okay. So, this is our very first verse, right? And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and explain it for us. The cardboard. What is this cardboard? This cardboard is the cardboard on which a photograph is stuck, glued. Think about a time when photo frames weren't a very big thing, or at least photo frames of the kind that we know now, made of like maybe wood or metal or all of these new materials that we use to make photo frames. That wasn't a big thing back then. So people used to take like photographs, which are after all really thin, and paste them on things like cardboard to make sure that they wouldn't get lost and they wouldn't get torn by time. So that's what this cardboard here is. The cardboard is the cardboard on which the photograph is stuck. So it's basically referring to the photograph that gives the poem its title, which is a photograph. And what does the photograph show? The photograph shows our narrator how it was when the two girl cousins went paddling. What is paddling? Paddling can mean sort of being in a boat and going through water, but it can also mean when you are standing in water and the water is kind of washing over your feet and you're walking in water. So you're paddling in water. That's sort of padding through the water, walking through it. So we know that in the photograph there are two girl cousins. We know that there is some kind of water source in which they're playing. And we know each one holding one of my mother's hands. And she, the big girl, some 12 years or so. And we know that these two girl cousins are holding on to somebody else's hand. And this somebody else is the narrator's mother. And the narrator's mother is the big girl among the three of these girls. And she is how old? She is 12 years or so old. So this photograph is a photograph of the narrator's mother's childhood. So it isn't even directly connected to the narrator. It's connected to the narrator through the narrator's mother. And the photograph shows a moment from the narrator's mother's past when the narrator's mother and her cousins went to the sea. And, well, you don't know that it's the sea yet, but you'll know in a bit. They went to the sea, and back then the narrator's mother was the oldest of the cousins, and her younger cousins are holding onto her hands and they're in the water and they're playing. It's a very sweet moment, and that's confirmed for us in the next line, which tells us, all three stood still to smile through their hair at the uncle with the camera. So all three of the cousins are standing still and they're smiling at whoever is taking this photograph, and we hear that it's an uncle with a camera who's taking the photograph, and they're smiling through their hair. Think about being outside and there being a lot of wind and you play, your hair is going to go everywhere, right? So that sort of wild hair, not orderly, and they're all smiling at the uncle with the camera. And these couple of lines tell us that it's a photograph of a good memory from childhood. It's a photograph of a day spent playing with family that you seem to be close to because you're holding hands and you're smiling. So we know it's a good day also. A sweet face, my mother's. That was before I was born. And the narrator tells us that her mother's face was very sweet at the age of 12, and of course, if her mother is 12, then it's long before the narrator has been born. And the sea, and this is how we know that the sea is also in the photograph, which appears to have changed less. washed their terribly transient fate. And the narrator tells us that the sea in the photograph hasn't changed, and it hasn't changed to this day in which the narrator is writing this poem or telling us about what's going on in this photograph. The sea hasn't changed across all of this time, and the comparison, the implicit comparison, is to the cousins who have changed, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But this sea, which is unchanging, washed their terribly transient feet. So the sea is washing over the feet of these girls, and the narrator describes the feet as terribly transient. Transient means temporary. It means that it's not going to last very long, and terribly places an emphasis on that transience. It says it's like saying awfully transient, very transient. So very temporary feet. This is just for you to sort of maybe take a screenshot if you want the definitions, or maybe just take a second look at the words if you want some definitions. Okay, so some themes that we're going to get into now. First things first, we know immediately that the narrator is talking to us about a photograph. It's a photograph from very, very long ago. It's a photograph not even from the narrator's past, but from her mother's past. So like an entire generation's worth of time has that photograph has come from back then. We also see in the way the narrator describes the photograph that this photograph contains an entire story, right? It tells us so much about the people in it. It tells us what they look like. It tells us where they were. It even tells us something about the emotions they were feeling back then. So many things that it tells us, and so the photograph is given to us like it's a story, and that emphasizes how photographs can be a form of preserving and safeguarding memories, a way of kind of taking a moment and capturing it and keeping it. That's some stuff that this first verse offers us immediately at first glance. And the second major thing that this verse offers us is in those very last two lines, you know, when we're talking about the sea, which has changed less, as opposed to the terribly transient feet that the sea is washing over, the narrator sets up an opposition. And the narrator tells us the sea is unchanging, or the sea is changing very little, because even nature does change over time, which we definitely know because of things like climate change. But even so, the ways in which nature changes and the ways in which nature shifts are a lot slower than the ways in which human beings change, than the ways in which human beings shift, which is very dramatic and drastic and happens very quickly. And this emphasizes to us the fact that humans live for a very short time and they don't have terribly long lives, and then there's nature which lasts for a long time and outlives human beings. So that sort of contrast is being made here. This is our second verse. Some 20, 30 years later, she'd laugh at the snapshot. "See Betty and Dolly," she'd say, "and look how they dressed us for the beach. The sea holiday was her past, mine is her laughter." We're going to do this segment first, and then we're going to get into the last line a little bit later. Some 20, 30 years later, she here is the narrator's mother. The narrator's mother looks at the snapshot, the photograph, and she laughs. And she says, "Oh, look at Betty and Dolly," and those must be her cousins. "And look how they dressed us for the beach. And look how they," presumably the family of these girls, "dressed these girls up for this beach day out." And so here we get the narrator's mother telling her the story of the day that photograph was taken also. So first we got the story of the photograph from the narrator, and now we're getting a direct insight into how the narrator's mother also tells the story of that day. And we see that she also laughs at it. So there's still some joy lingering when she looks at that photograph, something that the photograph evokes of that long gone day, that sort of merriness that comes in from the past into the present because of looking at that photograph. So the photograph becomes a medium through which that joy comes back a little bit. The sea holiday was her past, mine is her laughter. The narrator tells us that the mother's past was the sea holiday, and the narrator's past is her mother's laughter. So we know that this scene that the narrator is telling us about, in which the mother laughs at the photograph and tells her about the day that Betty and Dolly and she went to the beach, is also in the past. That the daughter is now sitting here in some other present, and she is talking about that particular past moment when her mother tells her about the story in the photograph and laughs about it. So that laughter is the past of the narrator, is in the past of the narrator. Both rhyme with the labored ease of loss. We're gonna break that line down a bit, but in advance of breaking that line down, the reason that the narrator's laughter, that the narrator's mother's laughter is part of the narrator's past, is because her mother is now dead. So she hasn't heard that laughter in a very long time. So not only is it the fact that this laughter and this moment, this particular moment that the narrator and the mother shared, where they discussed this photograph, not only is that particular moment in the past, the actual laughter of the mother is also something of the past, because the narrator hasn't heard it in a long time, because her mother has been dead for quite a long time, as we'll find out in the next class. And that's why the entire question of loss comes into this picture, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. Themes that we're going to talk about for a bit. So in the very first line, it says 20, 30 years later. And part of it might just be that the narrator doesn't remember exactly when it happened. Was it 20 years later? Was it 30 years later? The narrator doesn't know the exact moment. But another way of reading that line is thinking 20, even 30 years later. So the narrator's mother seems to look at the photograph again and again, or tell the story again and again. So 20 years later, and again 30 years later. So over time, a repetition of this sort of event happens. That's also a suggestion that's in 20, 30 years ago. And it's a very plausible, it's a very easily possible suggestion, because people do go back and look at photographs again and again a lot. And a photograph is an opportunity to remember something, to reminiscence about something, to go back in time and think about that moment and live in that moment again. We see the mother doing this in the previous paragraph. So that's another theme here. And when the mother laughs, there is a sense of loss in it. That's what the very last line tells us. We'll break down that last line a little bit in the very next slide. But that sense of loss that comes with looking at an old photograph and thinking about an event in the past, it tells us that memories can also bring up some sort of sorrow. Because of course they happened in the past. They're over now. And though we can be happy that they happened, it's also still sad that they're gone. I know that sounds like a Tumblr quote. I know that probably is a Tumblr quote. But yeah, that's actually like a very genuine theme that this particular verse of the poem does bring up. Okay, and now getting into that last line, which is full of a lot of things. The narrator tells us, both rye with the labored ease of loss. I'm just going to take us back. Both rye with the labored ease of loss. What does both refer to here? It refers to the past. Not only the past of the mother, but the past of the narrator. So both the sea holiday and the laughter. And so this past, which is for each of them different, a different past, is rye with the labored ease of loss. So the memory that they both have of these two different events, for the mother the sea holiday, for the daughter the memory of her mother's laughter, both of those memories, both of those pasts are ripe with the labored ease of loss. Now we're going to talk about what ripe with the labored ease of loss means. We'll go word by word, okay? What does rye mean? Rye is that sort of feeling when there's some bittersweetness. It's a really difficult situation, but you're finding some kind of pleasure in it or some kind of funniness in it, and it's not really funny because you can't be completely amused by whatever it is. You can't just laugh at whatever it is, but you can also laugh at whatever it is, even though it's very difficult. So that's the kind of feeling that rye brings across. So these memories are rye. They're both bitter and sweet. And why are they both bitter and sweet? They're rye with the labored ease of loss. Labored means difficult. It means something that's taking a lot of effort, a lot of labor, work to do. So labored. So what here is taking a lot of work to do? Ease. Labored ease of loss. So the narrator here, this is a bit of a confusing phrase, right? You look at it and you're like, difficult ease of loss. What does that mean? How can loss be both easy and difficult? They're both words that simply don't easily, sorry, that's a bad joke, easily go together, right? But the narrator's trying to convey to us here the feeling that think about it this way. If you're in a swamp, for instance, and the water all around is very, very muddy, very, very sticky, and you have to wade through the swamp, and you kind of pick your foot up and you put it down, and that takes a lot of effort. You pick your foot up and you put it down, and that takes a lot of effort, and you keep going. And as you keep going, you get used to that movement, you get used to that effort that it takes. But that doesn't mean that the effort is any less, and it doesn't mean that the task got easier necessarily, and that's the kind of sense that comes here with labored ease. You get accustomed, you get familiarized, you get used to that loss, but it takes a lot of effort even as you're used to that loss. That's one way of understanding the line, that it's difficult and yet you get used to it, to that sense of loss. Another way of understanding that line is loss comes very easily, right? It happens a lot, and yet it brings a lot of difficulty and effort. So those are some ways of understanding that line. And with the entire line, both rye with the labored ease of loss, what the narrator is trying to tell us is both of those memories for the both of these people, the narrator and the mother, are bittersweet with the difficulty, the pain, and also this sort of familiarity of loss. Now, what have both of these people lost in these two different equations? The narrator's mother, the memory that she has is of this holiday of her childhood, and she's lost her childhood, right? She's looking back at this 20-30 years later, which means that she is now 32, 42, something like that. So when she looks back at that photograph, the loss that she feels is the loss of her childhood. And when the narrator looks back at the moment in which her mother tells her the story about the photograph, the loss that she feels is the loss of her mother and her mother's laughter. So both of them are looking back at these memories with a sense of loss. And that's what this final line tries to tell us. And yeah, this is basically what I said. They're both sort of mourning, they're grieving for a time in the past, the narrator's mother for her past and the narrator for her past. Now she's been dead nearly as many years as that girl lived. The narrator tells us that she, who is the mother has been dead for as many years as that girl being the childhood version of the mother who was 12 years old, lived. So the narrator is telling us that her mother has been dead for 12 years. And in this circumstance, there is nothing to say at all. And of the fact that her mother is dead, the narrator can't bring herself to say anything about it. She says there's nothing to speak about this. And then the narrator says, its silence silences. Its silence silences. We're going to break this line down to sort of a little slowly, bit by bit. What does its mean? What is the its that the... What is its referring to? Its here is referring to the circumstance of the death, right? Of this circumstance, there is nothing to say at all. And this circumstance of her death, that is the its that it comes up here. That's what this pronoun refers to. So the death, the silence of the death silences. The narrator tells us that there's nothing to say about this death, and she tells us that death brings on this sort of lack of words, this lack of any sort of expression, that all brings us this wordless silence. So that's what the narrator tells us first. And this is the silence of death. So death silences. And the silence silences the narrator in turn. So the sort of speechlessness that death brings on silences the narrator. So the circumstances bring on silence, and that silence silences the narrator. I hope that makes sense. I hope that's clear. And that's how we can read that particular last line. Its silence silences. Silence of the death silences the narrator, or whoever so has experienced the death of somebody close to them. But if we leave that there, if we leave that sentence there, we'd still be understanding the sentence, but we'd be missing out on some of the depth that we can take out from that sentence. So we're going to look a little more closely into that sentence, and we're going to look into it with regard to the whole poem, right? So here, in this moment, there is silence silencing, and the circumstances of the mother's death silences. But in the last stanza, what we had was a moment when the narrator and her mother share some laughter, or the narrator's mother laughs. So there's this sound, right? And it's a sound of sort of joy, and that, in contrast to this kind of silence, kind of highlights how the laughter is associated with the presence of the mother, and this silence is sort of associated with the absence of the mother. So that the fact that immediately before there was some noise and now there is silence, that sort of contrast also brings home to us what the presence of the mother is like versus the absence of the mother is like, what that past memory is like versus what this present moment when the mother is no longer there is like. That's something that we can think about when we think about silence silencing. And so that silence, by which I mean the absence of that laughter and the absence of that sound of her mother's laughter silences the narrator. And that's another way that we could understand this last sentence. And one final way is that it really silences the narrator, right? This is where the poem ends. The narrator tells us, the death silences me, and then she stops talking. She just says nothing else to us. So that's a great ending. She's showing us how the silence of that death silences her. The moment she's told us, my mother died, that's it. It's over for us. The poem is over. Yeah. So those are some ways in which we can understand that final line. Okay, themes. Themes in this entire poem, really, because we've discussed the passage by passage, stanza by stanza, verse by verse bit. First big theme is memory. Second big theme is time. And a third big theme is loss. And we're going to talk about how all of these are connected. So let's start with what evokes a memory. What makes us remember a memory? And in this poem, it's not just the photograph which evokes a memory, by which I mean that actually it's the photograph that evokes two different kinds of memories. One, it reminds someone of the memory contained in that image in the photograph, of that sea holiday in the photograph. And two, it reminds someone of a memory created with someone else about that photograph. So, for instance, for the mother, it evokes the memory of what's in the photo. And when the narrator looks at the photo, it reminds her of a different moment with her mother when both of them were looking at that photo together. So the photograph has sort of evoked two different kinds of memories here. So that's an interesting thing, because that doesn't usually happen. Usually when people talk about a photograph evoking a memory or a photograph reminding us of something, they mean what's in the photograph reminds us of something. But here's something outside the photograph, but about the photograph or surrounding the photograph also reminds the narrator of something, brings up a memory for the narrator. So yeah, that's interesting. And loss is also a very big theme in this, and there are two different kinds of loss which we discussed when we were talking about the end of the second verse, both rhyme with the laboured ease of loss. And the two losses are the end of childhood and the end of a life. And both of these are, I mean, even the end of a childhood is a little bit the end of a particular segment of life, right? It's something you can't go back to. And just like that, the death of someone means that there's someone you can't go back to. So it's a very final kind of ending. Both of these are very final kinds of losses. So that's something that also comes across in this poem. And I want us to kind of spend some time now rereading the poem together. Actually, I'm not going to read it for you this time. You can sort of look at it and scroll through the slides with like 30 seconds for each slide, and look at it and think this time about the big structure of the poem. What each verse, why is it split into three verses? Why, for instance, does the narrator, does the poet stop here and start a new verse after that? Why is this only one single verse? So we're thinking about this kind of breakup of the poem and why it's broken up like this. So that's something we're going to think about. We're going to think about literary devices in the poem, how words are being used in places, what sorts of work the words are doing. So that's another thing. And we're also going to think about rhyme schemes. So, have a look at those things and read the poem this time with all of those in mind, and then we'll start discussing those. So I'm just going to give you a couple of seconds for each bit. Shift again. Okay, I hope you got a bit of a chance to read the poem and think about those big thoughts. So first thing, this poem doesn't have a rhyme scheme. It's very obvious, right? There are no rhymes at all anywhere. This is something called a blank verse. Blank verse is a genre of poetry. It's when a poem simply chooses not to go in for rhymes at all. It just goes with whatever flow it has of its own. And that's what this poet has chosen to do. She has chosen to write in blank verse. We just read a blank verse poem for grade 12 yesterday too, and I was saying there that blank verse is very common these days. Yeah. So that's first. And why are these three verses these three verses? By which I mean, why is the poem broken up like this? How did the poet choose to stop here and start again here, stop there and start again there? You know, it's very interesting because it starts out with this big kind of like verse, and then it becomes smaller, then it becomes even smaller, and you end up wondering why and what's going on with these kinds of divisions that are going on. And one obvious thing that we can see when we look at these three verses is that they're located at different points of time, right? The first one is located in the past of the mother, so the very distant past. The second one is located in the past shared by the narrator and her mother, so a more recent past. And then we move into the very present of the narrator when her mother is dead and has been dead for the last 12 years. And that is the conclusion, the present. So these three verses move us from the past to the past to the present. So in each we take this sort of leap through time. So that's what the breakages into the verses are doing for us here. They're showing us this kind of leap of time, and the sort of smallness of that final verse especially is very interesting because the most focus here is put on the mother by the poet and the narrator, right? The first verse is long and it focuses on the past of the mother, and the second verse is a little shorter but it still focuses on the mother, and then the third verse moves to the present and it tells us a little bit about where the narrator is now, at what point, and then it stops. Because this poem really isn't actually focused on the narrator so much as it's focused on the narrator's feelings about her mother, the narrator's loss of her mother, and also the narrator's memory of her mother that she thinks about when she looks at this photograph. So this is really all about the point of view of the narrator and how the narrator feels about her mother and these stories of her mother. So we know this because of the way that these verses are shaped and the sort of size of these verses and who they lay emphasis on. This isn't to say the narrator isn't important. The narrator is obviously important because it's her feelings that are coming out a lot here, that kind of loss, but that kind of loss of her mother, and that's why she's thinking about her mother so closely. But what is important to the narrator here is her mother. So that's what is laid the most focus on in this poem. I hope that makes sense. That tells us something about the structure of this poem and the way that it's been broken up. And now let's get into literary devices or poetic devices or figures of speech, whatever you want to call them. Yes. So first, we have quite some alliteration in this poem. What is alliteration? Before I tell you the examples of the literary devices in the poem, I'll also kind of go through like a very quick explanation. If you already know this, I'm sorry, but maybe it can serve as a very quick revision. Yeah. So an alliteration is when two words next to each other start with the same kind of sound. I say that because at one point of time I used to think that it was anything that started with the same letter, but that's not true. The same letter can like be pronounced very differently. Take C, for instance, is pronounced very differently in certain cases. So yeah, so the sound is really what matters. So in this poem we have terribly transient, and in both these cases the T is the T sound, and then we have stood still to smile, and all of that is sa sa sa. So the sound remains the same, and because of that these are both alliterations. Generally we end up ignoring very small letters like small words, sorry, like to or an or a. Those end up not really mattering, and to that repetition of sound, if there's a word like this, then we still tend to say, oh, it's an alliteration, because the sound is still very strongly there. So that's the alliteration in this poem. There is also something in this poem called a transferred epithet. What's a transferred epithet? A transferred epithet is when an adjective, generally, but other things also, end up getting associated with something apart from what they are describing. That sounds very confusing. I'm going to explain it again with an example. Okay, take for instance, if I'm at like very big height and I look down and I'm like, these are dizzying heights, then in that moment I am telling you that the heights are dizzying, or that's what it sounds like, right? The adjective comes with heights, and so you think dizzying is being used to describe the heights, and that's true, the heights are dizzying, but here it sounds like the heights are dizzying, which sorry, let me repeat that. What I'm trying to tell you is that the adjective is kind of being used to describe the heights, right? Dizzying heights, the heights dizzy. But who it's dizzying for is me, the person who is looking down and feeling that dizziness. So I'm feeling that dizziness, but I am ascribing it, I am putting it in connection with the heights. So that's an example of a transferred epithet, when something is associated with something that is not the thing that it is actually being used to describe. So we'll go over it again. We'll go over the concept again with this example from the poem. Transient feet is a transferred epithet. Transient means temporary. Feet. Here, what the narrator, what the poet is trying to tell us is that the people in the photograph are what are transient, right? Their lives are short, and they're very temporary in comparison to nature. But how is it put forward to us? It's put forward to us as transient feet. And this doesn't mean that it's only the feet that are temporary, it's the entire person who is temporary. But that temporariness, which is meant to describe the entirety of that human being, is only put next to the feet and is used next to the feet. So that kind of temporariness of the entire person is transferred, it's moved to just the feet. The meaning remains the same, but it's expressed in a different way. And I hope that made a bit more sense than my very dizzying explanation about dizzying heights. Another poetic device, literary device, is personification. Personification is when an inanimate object is given animation. So for instance, in this poem we have the cardboard shows, the cardboard being the back of the photo, the back on which the photo is stuck. So the photo can't actually show anything. It's just a way of saying that looking at the photograph shows me something. But the way it's phrased makes it sound like the cardboard is performing the action. And that is what I mean when I say personification is when an inanimate object like a cardboard is being ascribed, is being given an action like shows. And again, there is personification in silences. Um, and also the circumstances, silences, its silences. That's personification again, because it's the inanimateness of the circumstances, silencing, performing an action of silencing. So yeah, those are a couple of examples of personification from this poem. And there is also an oxymoron in this poem. An oxymoron is, wait a minute, I have written this wrong. It's actually just sort of labored-ese. It's not belabored-ese. Sorry about that. But yeah, an oxymoron is when two words that are opposite in meaning are put next to each other to create a phrase. For instance, labored-ese, difficult-ese. That doesn't entirely seem like it makes complete sense because they're both opposites. And that's what an oxymoron is, when two words that are opposites are put right next to each other. If you say, for instance, you're awfully good, or something like that, or your piano skills are awfully good, and you really mean to say very, very good, but awful means terrible and good means good, so those two oppositions, those two antonyms don't entirely, they seem to contradict each other, and so they created a phrase that is known as an oxymoron. And in this poem, our example is labored-ese. I think that's it for the poetic devices, and yeah, that is it for poetic devices, and that is it for our class today. I hope you liked that. I hope you liked this poem. And I hope you enjoyed especially some lines in it. I really liked some lines in it. If you had a favorite line or something like that, then let me know. I would love to hear about it. All of that said, I also want to tell you about the Unacademy app, which is on Google Play Store. You can kind of just go look it up and download it. It has a ton of features on it. You can do quizzes, you can do these live tests, you can ask a doubt, and I'll talk about the ask a doubt feature in a moment. You can access also study material, PDFs, these kinds of slides that we show you. You get access to them in the form of PDFs with the notes and stuff, so you get all of that for free. So it has a lot of these features for free, and you can basically download it and sign up for it using the details that are relevant for you. You'll have to tell them which grade you're in, which language you'd prefer to learn in, and along the way you can use my code. It's THAR01, and after trying all of these features out, actually, one sec, I want to tell you about this particular feature, right? How to ask it out. There's like a very obvious little button. It's called Ask a Doubt. You click on it and then you take a photo, or maybe you already have a photo, so you just pick the photo and of the question, the doubt that you have, and you choose the subject that the question falls under, and you send it. And somebody will definitely get back to you. So if you have any questions about a particular subject, if you have something that's not been answered yet, or you got a practice test paper recently, or you wrote an exam recently and you're not sure about what answer was the answer to a particular question, then you should put it up and people will eventually get back to you on that. So that's the Ask a Doubt feature, and you should go try that out. But yes, I was telling you about the app, and it has all of these free features, but you can get access to even more features if you go in for Unacademy Plus, which is the subscription. It gives you access to more study material, it gives you access to a lot more courses, it gives you access to these things we have called doubt clearing sessions and answer writing sessions, where we kind of just have one session that's completely for talking about doubts that you all have, and how we write answers and practicing things like that, and a lot of live tests also. So those are a lot of things that Unacademy Plus gives you. So check out the app, see if you like the features, see what about it you enjoy, and if you want more of that, then Unacademy Plus is a way for you to get more of that. So then you can consider signing on for a subscription. And if you do want to sign on for a subscription, then these are the prices. As you can see, the price kind of reduces the longer you take the subscription for. So the per month cost will be only like 1,000 if you take it for 24 months, which is 2 years, and you're in 11th grade, you're just starting 11th grade, so that will be this year and next year. So that will be convenient. Yeah, so that's the Unacademy pricing, subscription pricing, the plus subscription pricing. And you can, that code that I gave you, THAR01, you can use it if you want to get a 10% discount on these prices. So that would reduce the price even further for you. And there is also something called Unacademy Iconic. It's a step beyond Unacademy Plus. Unacademy Plus is still collective courses, you're still doing all of this in groups. But in Iconic, you sort of end up getting personal attention. There's someone who will be working with you, especially. There'll be someone who helps you particularly. There'll be weekly reports for you. There'll be the possibility of your parents talking to these people and keeping up with how you're doing and things like that. So Iconic is for a more individualized kind of education pattern, if that's something something you want. And again, these are the prices, and again, it reduces if you take it for a longer duration of time. The per month cost reduces. And right now, there is actually a very cool offer going on. Until 30th August, you basically get a flat 10% discount if you get a plus subscription, whatever duration you get it for, whether it's for 2 months or longer or even longer. Not 2 months, but yeah, these are the sets of months, and these are the quantities of like free time that you'll get from it. And it's valid only for the first 500 people who go and take advantage of this. So if you want to subscribe, then this is a great time to subscribe. You'll get this great offer if you subscribe at this point in time. So yeah, I wanted to let you know about that too. So go check out the app, see if you like it. And thank you for being here today. Thank you for listening to this lesson. If you liked it, then leave a like. If there's something specific that you would like me to change or some sort of feedback you want to give me, then leave a comment. And if you enjoy our content, then do subscribe. Thanks, and see you again soon.